Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. I intended on solely discussing the recent US operation in Venezuela today. In part, today's episode will be discussing this, but the United States and Donald Trump in the last few days have made moves that will reverberate throughout the entire year and beyond. These recent moves will also affect many other countries outside of Venezuela and the United States as we start 2026. So today, I will discuss the recent moves in Venezuela, why the United States made these moves, and what this will mean for the United States and the wider geopolitical world in 2026 and beyond. First, I'm going to start by discussing the background that led to the recent events in Venezuela. Back in September 2025, I released 2 episodes on Venezuela. The first was called Knocking on Venezuela's Door, and the second was called Kicking Down Venezuela's Door. The first discussed the potential for Trump and the United States to pivot towards the Western Hemisphere in what has been called the Donroe Doctrine. This is, of course, based on the Monroe Doctrine, which was the United States' foreign policy position that opposed any foreign powers interfering in the Western Hemisphere. At the time of this first discussion, knocking on Venezuela's door back in September 2025, a pivot of the United States towards North and South America was notable because the initial expectation is that this would divert efforts away from the Indo-Pacific. At the time, this was the geopolitical theatre that I believed the United States would be most active in. Action in the Indo-Pacific didn't have to be direct, but I did believe that the United States would focus on the Indo-Pacific because its greatest geopolitical rival is China. I will come back to this point later in this episode. In exploring this potential pivot of the United States back towards the Western Hemisphere, there was some clear signs that this was occurring. The military escalation in the Caribbean Sea started in August of 2025, and an initial information reward that was placed on Maduro in January of 2025 was doubled in August 2025. Also, a few months prior to this, we saw elections in Venezuela in May of 2025 that saw Maduro cling on to power, with many people contesting the validity of the results. Tensions clearly existed between the United States and Venezuela throughout 2025, but at the time of this first discussion, it was unknown which direction this was heading in. In the second discussion, kicking down Venezuela's door, it was potential future scenarios that I discussed. The expected scenarios ranged from a purely psychological strategy from the United States to a direct military clash between Venezuela and the United States. I argued back in September 2025 in this discussion that every scenario was a possibility because Trump had discussed so many of them as potential options. Ultimately, as we entered 2026 and as the US operation in Venezuela unfolded, we then knew which scenario Trump and the United States pursued. So, with all this being said, how did this operation unfold? Well, firstly, the aim of the operation was to take Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife from Venezuela and to take them to New York to stand trial. According to an article from Sky News that I will link in the description of this episode, these were the key details from this operation. Firstly, months of spying, CIA operations in Venezuela, and the weather were vital considerations in this operation. The CIA on the ground in Venezuela had learned everything they could about Maduro's routine, including where he was and what he was doing as often as possible. Once the CIA operations were sufficient enough, the weather then became the deciding factor for this operation. It was reported that US forces were ready for this operation by early December. This is likely why Trump promised the $1,776 warrior dividend to active duty and eligible reserve service members. This is likely because they were waiting on suitable weather conditions in Venezuela and hence would be working throughout December and into the new year. More than 150 aircraft took part in the operation, which included F-22s, F-35s and F-18s. These aircraft first sought to disable the air defense systems in Venezuela. The US helicopters then arrived at Fort Tiuna, which is the military site where Maduro was captured. US forces landed there at 1:01 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. Maduro and his wife reportedly gave up and were taken into custody. By 3:29 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the group had successfully extracted Maduro and his wife, and they were back over the Caribbean Sea. Now, initially, there are a few notable conclusions that jumped out from this series of events. Firstly, they kidnapped Maduro and his wife with little resistance. In the aftermath, we did find out that 32 Cubans were killed alongside some Venezuelans, but they were all likely a part of Maduro's security team. Cuba is quiet about its security and intelligence support for Venezuela, but the presence of Cubans does make it clear that cooperation exists. At the minimum, this cooperation exists within the security apparatus in Venezuela. This does imply, with the United States being able to enter with relative ease, that they had some support. Secondly, the timings that US forces spent on location are notable. They were on site in Fort Tiuna for over 2 hours. This was reportedly to secure the site, but only 7 Americans were injured in this lengthy operation, and 5 are already back to active duty. Typically, in these high-stake military operations, speed and directness are pursued. For some reason, this operation differed. Finally, in the build-up to this, Maduro was accused of leading Cartel de los Soles. This was the main reason promoted for the US interest in Maduro stepping down as leader of Venezuela, because it was believed that Maduro led this group and that this group was funneling drugs into the United States. Once Maduro had been taken and flown to the United States, the Department of Justice rejected that Cartel de los Soles had ever existed. In the months before this operation, Maduro and Trump did share some phone calls. Maduro offered to step down slowly, but this was rejected by the United States. In November, Trump then warned Maduro that it would, quote, be in his best interest to step down and leave Venezuela. With this recent operation, this phone call in November was proven to be an ultimatum. One contributing reason for this operation's success could be due to a CIA source that was operating within Venezuela's government who helped to track Maduro. Based on the success of this operation, the intel that was collected was clearly extensive, and they likely had some support. One person who is rumoured to have aided in the capture of Maduro is Delcy Rodríguez, who was the vice president of Venezuela. It is even reported that secret meetings in the Middle East between Rodríguez and US officials contributed to Maduro's capture. Rodríguez in these meetings reportedly presented herself as a more acceptable alternative than Maduro. In the aftermath of this operation, Rodríguez has stepped up into the role of President of Venezuela. This ensures that despite many people naming this operation as an attempt at regime change, politically this isn't true. Rodríguez is now running the same political structure that Maduro did. In the last few days, Rodríguez has deployed armed militias to patrol the streets and arrest anyone who opposes the regime. Just because leadership has changed in Venezuela, Trump and the United States could still face issues in achieving their aims. We will now find out if the United States deems Rodríguez as a more acceptable option than Maduro. Trump has threatened Rodríguez, stating that if she doesn't work with the United States, she will suffer a fate much worse than Maduro. This is why Trump has rejected opposition leader Maria Corina Machado as a potential leadership candidate currently for Venezuela, even though he has seemingly supported her in the past. This is because he doesn't want Venezuela to flourish, he wants to benefit from controlling it. Now, the direction that we head in next for Venezuela under US control depends on what the United States wants to achieve in Venezuela. When Trump says that the United States will run Venezuela, he doesn't mean that literally, but he does mean that the United States will make every decision that is important regarding the future direction of Venezuela. Also remember, the naval blockade still remains, and the threat of potential future military raids does remain, with Trump stating that a second wave has already been discussed. Because of this blockade remaining in place, Venezuela will need some support, and in the current environment, this support is going to have to come from the United States. Just as the Food for Oil program was established by the United Nations in 1995 for Iraq, is the United States seeking to implement the same program on Venezuela. This is part of the first reason why the United States made this move for control on Venezuela, and it's because of crude oil. Crude oil isn't the entire story, but it is largely relevant here. Firstly, ExxonMobil is present in crude oil projects in Guyana. Venezuela, under Maduro, contested these waters. This could continue under Rodriguez, but the United States' operation in Venezuela has sought to protect its interests in Guyana. Secondly, Trump during his political career has seemingly obsessed over crude oil. Back in June of 2023, he stated that when he left office for the first time, quote, Venezuela was ready to collapse and we could have taken over. We could have had all that oil, end quote. He has also said in the past that the United States should have taken all of Iraq's oil. In the aftermath of this operation, Trump on paper will seemingly get his way when it comes to crude oil. Venezuela in the last few days has reportedly agreed to export crude to the United States, equivalent to between 30 million and 50 million barrels. However, this is easier said than done. Venezuela's oil industry has been decaying for years due to underinvestment. Their oil production and their oil exports have been falling since 2015, which aligns with the first US sanctions that were placed on Venezuela by the Obama administration. But despite its struggles in recent years, Venezuela does still possess the largest oil reserves in the world, with an expected 303 billion barrels. Despite Trump's interest in Venezuelan heavy crude, it is going to take a long time to get this industry up and running. Once it is up and running, US refineries on the Gulf Coast are suited to processing this heavy crude, but we could be years away from this. It is suspected that Venezuela currently produces less than 1 million barrels of crude oil per day. The Trump administration has stated that major oil companies will re-enter Venezuela. However, these companies are owed billions of dollars from previous periods in Venezuela, and they have said that they want serious guarantees before re-entering. Despite the promising sentiment that is coming out of the Trump administration, much work remains for them if this pursuit of Venezuelan crude is to be a success. On the surface, these narratives surrounding crude oil paint a picture that the United States is only interested in Venezuela's crude. This is part of the story, but the ultimate aim here remains to be Trump's pursuit of the Donroe Doctrine. The key detail of the Donroe Doctrine is that the United States wants to remove foreign powers from interfering in the United States' backyard. As a result of this, the United States' operation in Venezuela aims to undermine and rival the Chinese. On CNN, in the last few days, Stephen Miller has stated, quote, "We are a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. It is absurd that we would allow a nation in our own backyard to become a supplier of resources to our adversaries, but not to us." The resources that are being referred to is Venezuela's crude oil reserves, and the main adversary that is being referred to is China. A similar statement was also reiterated by US Ambassador to the UN, Michael Waltz. By possessing greater control of the world's crude oil, Trump hopes that oil prices will fall. This will have domestic benefits, such as the potential for gasoline prices falling, and for sticky inflation potentially falling along with it. From there, Trump hopes for domestic success in the midterms this November. But the United States is a global superpower, and as a result, they do somewhat have to focus on global affairs, regardless of how much it seems like Trump doesn't want to. In 2025, during the US-China trade deal discussions, the US very quickly realised the sheer number of options and cards that China holds that it can weaponize against the United States. In these trade talks, China agreed to scale back rare earth export controls and to restart soybean purchases. China still maintains the power to rescind these agreements. This is why we've seen the United States scrambling to diversify rare earth resources and to invest in building out a domestic rare earth industry. Also, it's notable that it was the United States who backed down from the tariff escalation and not China. Also, this trade agreement that was made last year is active for a year, and that means that it will be revisited in 2026. The United States, due to its vulnerability to China in certain areas, needs to pursue resiliency. This is the general idea behind the Donroe Doctrine. It is the United States trying to build a strong base so that it can pursue resiliency against the Chinese. Now, the United States is the biggest energy producer of crude oil and natural gas in the world. On paper, this sounds like a card that they could potentially play against the Chinese. Unfortunately for the US, China is the world's biggest total energy producer. With its move against Venezuela, the United States has undermined one source of China's energy that is equivalent to around 4% of Chinese crude oil imports. It's also notable that this 4% is only for crude oil imports. This doesn't include all other energy sources that China imports. China is very clearly diversified and resilient, and as a result, gaining leverage over them is tough. Despite this move not particularly hurting the Chinese much in terms of physical energy, it has angered them. Over a dozen Chevron tankers departed Venezuela ports over the last few days, heading to the United States. Any crude with an initial destination of China remains on hold. China holding leverage over the United States isn't to say that China is without any issues. Deflationary pressures still exist and their demographics are a worry. But in general, China holds more cards and more options that it can weaponize against the United States. Because of this, the United States is going to spend 2026 and beyond seeking to increase resilience and to potentially take some of these cards back. Diving into more detail, what could this pursuit potentially look like? This move against Venezuela should put other nations on guard. In the first few days of 2026, Trump has threatened Colombia, Cuba, Greenland, and Mexico. Last year, he also had aggressive rhetoric towards Brazil at times. All of these nations and territories would exist within the Western Hemisphere that the Donroe Doctrine would cover. Also, Trump and Argentina are economically tied together, with Trump providing a $20 billion bailout to Malay in 2025. This highlights that not all strategies pursued by the United States to increase resilience will involve military pressure. Now, as I've stated, against the Chinese, the United States does hold fewer cards that it can use aggressively. But for other nations, the United States does hold cards that it can play to squeeze them. I expect the next 3 years under Trump's presidency to see the United States attempt to boost its own cards by taking advantage of the relative weakness of other nations in comparison to itself. If these moves feel extreme, it ultimately comes down to the superpower conflict between the United States and China. In the past, In ruling power versus rising power geopolitical tussles, the ruling power will reach a point where it is typically declining and will have to fight aggressively to defend its position when incentivized to do so. In fact, these ruling versus rising power tussles typically do end in hot war. Now, the world has changed today. There are hybrid methods of war, so this isn't necessarily guaranteed, but it is a point that is incredibly notable, especially with how 2026 has started with this aggressive US operation in Venezuela. Now, ruling versus rising power battles don't always end up resulting in war. The UK, as a geopolitical superpower, did fade to the United States at the end of World War II without a direct conflict between the two. But this occurred over a long period, and many signs pointed towards its eventual inevitability, such as the US dollar growing as a global reserve currency. The UK had been declining for decades, and the United States allowed its natural tailwinds to accrue until its strength was undeniable. China hopes to do the same today, and the United States can't allow this. With the United States starting 2026 in this aggressive stance, some could argue that in 2025, the United States and Trump seemingly wanted to pursue peace around the world. In reality, their 2025 peace pursuits always saw the United States being self-interested. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they sought access to rare earths that would undermine China. In Israel and Gaza, they sought to expand the Abraham Accords that would isolate Iran. In Thailand and Cambodia, they would have pursued peace in geographic proximity to China. With Armenia and Azerbaijan, they would have pursued peace in proximity to Russia. In Venezuela, they have undermined Chinese energy access. And in Ukraine, they would have undermined Russia and then achieved economic deals with Russia that would have boosted the US's position and could have pulled Russia away from the Chinese in what has been referred to as the reverse Nixon strategy. In exploring the United States as adversaries, this doesn't only refer to China. The Russians and the Iranians are also notable adversaries, but it's clear as we head into 2026 that the United States will remain self-interested and they will keep making moves against these adversaries. In 2026, the Donroe Doctrine will see the United States as more of an aggressor, all in the name of self-preservation and self-interest. This aggression doesn't have to be purely military aggression. Marco Rubio has stated that the United States would prefer to use diplomatic means to get what it wants, but if this doesn't work, the United States will pursue alternative measures in its coercive pursuit of more options against the Chinese. In the worst case, this operation against Venezuela has proven that Trump is willing to use military force as a part of this hybrid war strategy. Since this line has been crossed, we could well see it again during the remainder of Trump's presidency. The United States does remain the world's strongest military power. This is an area in which they do possess options and they do possess cards that they can use to leverage their strengths. The worry is that in these situations, accidents can occur and an escalatory spiral can reach uncontrollable levels. As we continue to move forwards in 2026, let's hope that level heads do exist somewhere. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.